Four college students went to bed on a quiet Saturday night, and by morning, none of them were alive. There was no forced entry, no screams reported, and for hours, no one realized anything was wrong. Inside a house just steps away from the University of Idaho campus, something violent happened, quietly, deliberately, and fast. When police finally entered the home, they found a scene so disturbing that investigators would later say this was not a crime of panic, but a crime of intention. What makes this case even more chilling is this: people were awake in the house while the murders were happening, and yet the killer walked away. No weapon was found, no immediate suspect, and for weeks, the entire country was left asking the same question. How does someone brutally kill four young adults in the middle of the night and disappear into the dark? Then, months later, investigators made an arrest, not because of a confession, not because of eyewitnesses, but because of a single trace of DNA, cell phone data, and a pattern no one noticed at first. But even with an arrest, this case still leaves behind uncomfortable questions. Why this house? Why these students? And was this crime really as targeted as authorities claimed? Tonight, we are not here to judge. We are not here to speculate. We are here to walk through exactly what happened, step by step, from the final hours of these students' lives to the investigation that shocked a nation. And by the end of this video, you might realize this case is far more complicated than it first appears. Before we get into the details, here's what this video will do and what it won't. In this episode, we are going to carefully walk through the real, documented events of the Idaho student murders. We'll follow the timeline exactly as investigators reconstructed it, starting with the final hours before the attack, moving through the discovery of the crime, and ending with the arrest that stunned the public. You'll hear where the victims were that night, who they were with, and how their paths led them back to the house on King Road. We'll look at what police knew early on, what they didn't know, and how fear spread through a college town that suddenly realized a killer might still be nearby. We'll also break down the evidence as it emerged: surveillance footage, cell phone movements, and the small detail investigators say ultimately changed everything. But as we tell this story, there are moments that don't fully sit right, decisions that raise questions, gaps in the timeline that still make people uneasy. And instead of answering those questions today, we're going to let them linger. Because in the next video, we'll step back and analyze this case from a different angle: the psychology, the possible motivations, the social and environmental factors, and the theories that continue to divide people who have followed this case closely. So as you listen, pay attention to what stands out to you. Notice what feels clear and what feels unsettling. By the time we reach the end, you may already have your own theory forming. Before that night, Moscow, Idaho, was known as the kind of college town where very little ever happened. It was small, quiet, and tightly connected to the University of Idaho. Students walked home late at night without much fear. Parties were common. Doors were often left unlocked. Serious violent crime was rare. The house at 1122 King Road fit perfectly into that environment. It sat just off campus, slightly elevated, with multiple levels and easy access from the street behind it. To students, it was known as a social house, a place where friends came and went, where gatherings weren't unusual, where people felt safe. 6 people lived there. Kaylee Goncalves was 21 years old. She was close to graduating and had recently returned to Moscow to show friends her new car. She was described as outgoing, confident, and deeply close to her family. Madison Mogan, also 21, was Kaylee's best friend. The two were inseparable. Madison worked at a local restaurant and was known for her warm personality and strong friendships. Xana Kernodle was 20 years old. She lived in the house with her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin. Ethan was also 20 and a freshman at the University of Idaho. He was a triplet, a member of a fraternity, and by all accounts, kind-hearted and well-liked. Two other roommates also lived in the house. They would survive that night. On Saturday, November 12th, 2022, it was a normal college weekend. Football season, parties, late nights. Nothing that suggested the hours ahead would change the town forever. Kaylee and Madison spent the evening downtown. They were seen at a local food truck shortly before returning home. Xana and Ethan attended a party earlier that night before heading back to the house. By the early morning hours of November 13th, all four were inside the King Road home. Doors closed, lights off, the night settling into silence. What no one in that house knew was that, sometime after they went to sleep, that sense of safety would be shattered. And the way it happened quietly, methodically, would leave investigators struggling to understand not just what occurred, but how it was even possible. Because when the sun came up later that morning, the house looked ordinary from the outside. But inside, everything had changed. Sometime in the early hours of Sunday morning, while the rest of Moscow slept, something moved through the house on King Road. Investigators would later estimate the attack happened between 4 and 4:25 a.m., a narrow window of time, just minutes. The victims were in their bedrooms, some asleep, some possibly awake. Police believe the killer entered the house quietly. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing broken, no alarms triggered. Whatever happened next unfolded room by room, in the dark. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogan were found together on the third floor of the house. Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin were found on the second floor. Each victim had suffered multiple stab wounds. Investigators later said the injuries suggested a large, fixed-blade knife was used, a weapon designed not for chaos, but for control. What's difficult to grasp is how little noise was reported. There were no emergency calls during the attack, no neighbors reporting screams, no immediate reaction from anyone outside the house. At some point during the night, one of the surviving roommates woke up. She later told police she heard sounds coming from inside the house. At first, she thought it was normal, maybe someone playing with a dog, maybe friends moving around. Then she heard crying, then a male voice saying something like, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Moments later, she opened her door and saw a figure walking past her, a man dressed in black, a mask covering his nose and mouth, bushy eyebrows. He walked toward the sliding glass door and left. She locked herself in her room. Still, no call to police was made at that moment. Hours passed. By late morning, concern began to grow. Calls were made to friends. Then, a 911 call came in, not reporting a murder, but an unconscious person. When police arrived just before noon, they entered a house that, from the outside, gave no warning of what was inside. Inside, they found 4 young lives brutally taken. Within minutes, the scene was secured. Officers quickly realized this was not an accident, not an overdose, not a burglary gone wrong. This was a homicide, a quadruple homicide. Word spread fast. Parents flooded their phones with messages. Students locked their doors. Classes were canceled. A town that had felt safe the night before was suddenly on edge. And the most frightening part was this: there was no suspect, no weapon, and no clear motive. Whoever did this had vanished. And for the next several weeks, fear would hang over Moscow as investigators worked to answer a single question: how did this happen, and who did it? In the days that followed, investigators faced a case filled with pressure, uncertainty, and national attention. The crime scene stretched beyond the house itself. Police began canvassing the neighborhood, reviewing doorbell cameras, traffic cameras, and any surveillance that might show movement around King Road that night. They interviewed friends, classmates, and anyone who had been in contact with the victims in the days leading up to the murders. Phones were examined. Social media posts were reviewed. Timelines were rebuilt hour by hour. Early on, authorities emphasized that this was a targeted attack. They believed there was no immediate threat to the public, but for many people in Moscow, That reassurance rang hollow. Students left town, parents demanded answers. Rumors spread online at a pace investigators couldn't control. Some questioned how two roommates survived. Others speculated about strangers, parties, or people close to the victims. Every detail was dissected, often without context. Police remained careful with what they released. They confirmed the type of weapon believed to be used, but the knife itself was still missing. They acknowledged the surviving roommate's account, but offered few specifics. Weeks passed, with no arrest. Then, investigators asked the public for help identifying a white Hyundai Elantra seen driving near the house around the time of the murders. That request shifted the case. Thousands of tips poured in. The car became a focal point. People across multiple states began scanning parking lots, highways, and surveillance footage. Behind the scenes, detectives were building something larger. They tracked cell phone data. They analyzed travel patterns. They compared surveillance footage from different locations, slowly mapping a vehicle's movements before and after the murders. At the same time, a single piece of physical evidence was undergoing testing. Something small, easy to overlook, but potentially powerful. As December approached, investigators quietly zeroed in on a suspect. A man who lived miles away. A man who had studied criminal behavior. A man whose movements, according to police, aligned too closely with the timeline of the murders to ignore. On December 30th, 2 months after the killings, Brian Kohberger was arrested at his family's home in Pennsylvania. He was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. According to court documents, DNA found on a knife sheath left at the scene matched Kohberger. Investigators also pointed to cell phone data and surveillance footage, placing him in the area multiple times before the attack. For many, the arrest brought relief. For others, it raised even more questions. Because despite the evidence outlined by police, pieces of this case still feel incomplete. And as this story moves toward trial, those unanswered questions continue to linger. Questions about motive, timing, and what truly happened inside that house in the early hours of November 13th. Questions we will explore next. Even with an arrest and a detailed affidavit, the story does not end neatly. There are questions that remain, questions that investigators have not fully answered, and questions that continue to divide public opinion. Why this house? On this night? Among so many others nearby? If this attack was targeted, who or what was the target? And why were 4 people killed instead of 1? How did the killer move through the house without alerting everyone inside? And how did he leave without being stopped? Why was the knife sheath left behind when so little other physical evidence was recovered? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what was happening in the mind of the person who committed these murders before, during, and after that night? Authorities believe they have their suspect. The legal process will decide his fate. But understanding a crime is not the same as solving it. Because beyond the evidence, beyond the timelines and the data, there is a deeper layer to this case, one that involves behavior, psychology, opportunity, and motive. Before we end this story, take a moment to think about what you've heard. Think about the timeline, the movements, the moments that felt clear and the ones that didn't. If you were the investigator on this case, what would stand out to you the most? What detail feels too important to ignore? In the next episode, we won't just revisit what happened, we'll dig into why it may have happened. We'll explore the psychology behind the crime, the possible motivations, the social and environmental factors, and the elements that make this case so deeply unsettling. Because sometimes, the most important part of a crime isn't what we can see. It's what's happening beneath the surface. That analysis is coming next.